The first piece of the new power dynamics we're going to unpack today is how the competition for friends and influence in the Middle East and North Africa has been impacted by the conflict, impacted both by the decisions that nations are making and by the lessons that nations are learning. And these are lessons and decisions related to partnerships and alliances. They're related to trade and industry. They're related to defense modernization plans. Has Russia's purchase of Iranian drones impacted its relationships with countries on the western bank of the Gulf? Has the depletion of Russia's arsenal and military manpower impacted perceptions of Russia as a potential defense partner? Have China and the US created opportunity? Or have they lost ground in the region via their foreign policy decisions related to the conflict? Does the region feel more or perhaps less prone to having to pick a side? Even though the nations of the Middle East and North Africa oft repeat to us that this conflict is not in their neighborhood and it is not their priority, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the continuing war have forced these countries to undergo a reassessment of their foreign policies. And to help us wade through all of this today, no small feat, gentlemen, we are joined by Dr. Mark Katz, by Dr. Nikolay Kozhanov, and by Dr. Gangzheng She. All of whom are joining us both remotely and in person. We're really looking forward to hearing their expertise as they bring it from many different academic fields and locations. I want to remind everyone before we get started that you can submit questions only online. We will not be taking them in person. And online, you can submit them using the askac.org platform. So please go ahead and put your thinking caps on and start to do that. Let's introduce our speakers and our panelists. Dr. Katz is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University, where my nephew is a freshman this year, so thank you, Dr. Katz, for educating our future. His work focuses on relations between Russia and the Middle East and U.S. policy towards both. He's the author of several books, including Russia and Arabia, Soviet Foreign Policy Toward the Arabian Peninsula. Dr. Katz was formerly a Fulbright Fellow and a visiting scholar at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki, where I'm sure your former colleagues have a lot to say on this topic. And he is now a non-resident senior fellow here with us at the Atlantic Council. He did his master's degree here in Washington at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he earned his PhD from MIT. Dr. Kozhanov is a research associate professor at the Gulf Studies Institute of Qatar University. His research focuses on the geopolitics of Gulf energy, Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, and Iran's economy and foreign policy. Dr. Kozhanov has been a visiting fellow at a number of international think tanks, including Chatham House, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Carnegie Moscow Center. He holds a PhD in international economics and economic security from St. Petersburg State University. And Dr. Gangzheng She is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for Overseas Security at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He specializes on the involvement of China and other actors in Middle East from the beginning of the Cold War until the present, with an emphasis on the history of diplomacy. His works have been published by multiple journals and think tanks in the US, China, and Europe, and he has received fellowships from several institutes and trusts. Dr. She received his BA in Hebrew from Peking University and his PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis. So quite an array of specializations, academic backgrounds, and research areas of focus here. This is going to be a fantastic discussion. Mark, if you don't mind, let's start by addressing the issue that is always the elephant in the room for any discussion of U.S.-MENA relationships: perceptions of U.S. disengagement in the region. Despite the fact that the U.S. has spent the last year or more trying to make it clear in both word and deed that the U.S. remains committed, to what extent has the war in Ukraine changed relations between the U.S. and Gulf countries?
Well, certainly I think at the beginning of the war there was a period of adjustment, shall we say, in terms of American perceptions of what was going on. I think there was an assumption that America's traditional allies would simply support the U.S. and see Russia as a threat, just as America's Western allies did. And I think there was a tremendous amount of surprise that this didn't happen. Now, of course, there was a lead up to this. Obviously, there was a lot of our Middle Eastern partners were not happy with what they considered to be lack of support with regard to Iran. And obviously there was the criticism of certain governments, certainly by candidate Biden, talking about making Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and when newly inaugurated President Biden actually releasing intelligence about the involvement of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia with regard to the unfortunate death of Adnan Khashoggi. And I think that this would only be, in other words, why do this if one isn't trying to actually undermine this person? And so I think when it came time that the U.S. wanted something from a lot of these allies, their reaction was, well, no, you haven't been giving us what we want, and why should we give you what you want? And quite frankly, we see Russia as a partner. And I think that there was just a period of adjustment that how the U.S. had to think about its allies, and that we weren't going to necessarily change their mind, but we had to work with these governments, and that I think slowly but surely we've been moving in a positive direction.
Do you think that we are going to continue on this trajectory, or do you predict that there will be any changes in any of these alliances or decisions, anything that you see shaping up?
Well, I think that just as the U.S. Had to undergo a period of adjustment of its expectations with regard to its Middle East partners, I think that a lot of the Middle East governments have had to undergo some adjustment with regard to their view of Russia in particular. And certainly I think that Russia's reliance on Iran for drones, in other words, it shows that Russia isn't going to be that much of a partner for them with regard to Iran. And in fact, maybe the Russian-Iranian partnership strengthens Iran vis-a-vis them. So I think that I think there's been a renewed appreciation that we all need one another, and that I would hope that we would continue on this path, because I think that it's a case of either we hang together or we hang separately.
To that point, Nikolay, can you explain for us the evolution of Russia's interests in the MENA region since its invasion of Ukraine?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's interesting. We are in the second year of Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And right now, we already can say that the initial expectations that Moscow presence in the Middle East will increase were false. So will decrease, sorry, were false. Right now, we can say that in spite of all troubles, in spite of all initial setbacks that Russia indeed had in the region, Moscow managed to increase its presence. And it's largely explained by the fact that the meaning and importance of the region for Russia has substantially increased. First of all, at the political level, Middle East became definitely a political arena where Russia could demonstrate to its domestic public and to the world that it has not been isolated yet. Second, it can also try to create loopholes in the sanctions regime that was imposed against Russia by the international community. And so far, we can acknowledge that, again, in spite of all troubles, Moscow managed to find its way out. Not to say that its economic leverage of influence, given the region dependence on the agricultural supplies from abroad, substantially increased. And for instance, we can already see that the growing dependence on Russian agricultural supplies in Egypt made Cairo being far more cautious in the statements that the Egyptian leadership is making about the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Not to say, of course, that the region suddenly turned its roles in terms of the Russian interest in the military-industrial sector. If previously Moscow considered Iran, for instance, as a main market, or as one of the markets for its arms supplies, right now Iran became an important supplier of weapons to Russia itself. And finally, we could see that the importance of informal connections between the Russian political and economic elite and the region increased, given the volume of those pro-Putin's tycoons who would like to escape living in Russia during difficult times, but who could not afford going to the West increased, and they moved to the Middle East. And you can see them right now being in the UAE, to a less extent in Qatar, and finding also their refuge here, but also increasing the impact and influence of Moscow on the ground.
So, Nikolay, in addition to what you've covered on what the world needs from Russia and what Russians need in terms of places to hide their money and what Iran and Russia need from one another, is there anything that you would say the Gulf needs from Russia or North Africa needs from Russia? Anything that you think is impacting their calculus right now that we haven't already discussed?
Well, first of all, we definitely should remember about Russia's cooperation with OPEC and OPEC+. Here, where the interests of both the region and Russia are overlapping, and in spite of the fact that Russian oil output is decreasing, Moscow still remains one of the most important players in the market. And cooperation with it in terms of the shaping of the price dynamic definitely has importance for the region. Second, I would say that we could see we should consider those progress in Russia's relations with the region credited not only to the Russian diplomacy and its active efforts here, but largely to the perception of the situation by the regional players. So they have extremely pragmatic attitude towards the conflict. They believe that they should not be in a hurry to get involved in it on any side. And they also believe that right now they can use Russia as a certain card in terms of improving its relations with the West as well. So from this point of view, well, the risks of Russia in the Middle East, they are mostly created not by the war itself, but rather by the growing, I would say, on the one hand, dependence of Russia on the regional players. Both in terms of the military supplies or in terms of the way how Russia is trying to manage its situation, its approaches towards Syria, and not only, and also in terms how the relations of the regional players are developing with the West. As again, we could see from the experience of the previous year and a half, Moscow positions can be weakened when the US government exercises enough persistence in persuading the regional players to be far more stricter about the deals with Russia.
Excellent points. Let's turn to the third big competitor for power and influence in the region in terms of winning friends. Gangzheng, can you tell us, China was, on the face of it, the broker of a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia this spring. China signed an economic agreement with Iran in 2021. And there's differing analysis on how China sees the Russian talks with North Korea about arms deals. What do these talks, what do these deals all tell us? What is China's calculus in the region?
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. First of all, thanks. I want to thank Atlantic Council and ICPI for having me here, although it's a pity that I'm not available to be here in person. So I think this is a very important question to compare China's calculus when facing this kind of like different cooperations by different regional powers, not only in the MENA region or in Eurasia. But although I want to point out a very important difference that you mentioned about China's different approach to the this kind of like a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran and between Russia and North Korea, is that China is inside this kind of like a peace deal between Riyadh and Tehran, but China is not kind of like, officially speaking, is not part of this kind of like negotiations and cooperations, at least for now, between Pyongyang and Moscow. So I think this is a very important difference. So I think there has been so many people talking about China's different kind of like considerations when they trying to promote this kind of like a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, trying to secure their cooperation with China, trying to create this kind of like economic prospect, maybe in the long run about this kind of like trilateral cooperation to have more, to transfer China's kind of like production capabilities to the region, or to bypass the US or the West sanctions in the future, or in kind of like creating some kind of like new international norms that China or some other countries can try to promote the de-escalation in the Middle East without kind of like a significant military buildup or deterrence in the region. So I think these are the kind of like essential possible considerations in China's behavior or support behind the rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh. However, regarding what you mentioned about this new development between Russia and North Korea, I think China is actually in a more awkward kind of like a position. It was facing kind of like dilemmas. So I think it is even more troublesome than what Middle East will pose this kind of like challenge to China. I think on the one hand, China doesn't want to see the collapse of Russia or North Korea. So I think that if Russia and North Korea could support each other when they are facing this kind of a pressure from the US-led alliance, this could at least help each other. So it will, to some extent, to help the survival of their regimes respectively. But on the other hand, I think that as we can see nowadays, we can see this kind of like the seemingly a deja vu of what happened in 1950 in Northeast Asia, that the South Korea, Japan, and the United States on one side, and North Korea, Russia, and probably China on the other side. So this kind of like be a kind of like a trouble for China, because China doesn't want to see this kind of like intensification of regional confrontations. So I think this is has been a very important difference. And I think that both Russia and North Korea have this kind of like a mindset that they could use China as the safety net, that in case there is a severe confrontations between them with the West or with the United States in particular, they could kind of like expect China will come to their aid. But I think that for the Middle Eastern powers, especially as the Gulf countries, in particular Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think they will more or less just to think that China is more like alternative option or contribution to their interest or safety. So this is the primary difference.
Fascinating. Mark, can we turn back to you based on what we just heard from Gangzheng? How has the conflict in Ukraine affected the U.S. disengagement process when they know that there is perhaps an alternative seeking process going on in the region itself? What has the war taught Washington about the limits or the extent of its influence in the Middle East?
Well, certainly I think that, as I indicated earlier, that obviously we're not, and there's not automatically getting support from our Middle East partners on this. On the other hand, I think that what we've also learned is that the Middle East, especially the oil-producing countries, are very vital. In other words, that their activities are part and parcel of sort of how the diplomacy over the war in Ukraine, and certainly oil production, and whether or not there's cooperation between these countries and Russia, and there is, and I think it's more a question of how do we ourselves adjust to this. I think also that what we're seeing is that there has to be more, I think, a focus on realpolitik. In other words, that and I'm sorry that human rights can't be sort of the main element of the American foreign policy, as I think the Biden administration would actually like, but that we're involved in a conflict. We cannot get everything we want from everyone we want. And so I think that the U.S. has to learn to prioritize. And I think also the Middle Eastern countries have been prioritizing as well. In other words, that They have not come firmly on the support of the U.S. and Ukraine, but gradually they've been moving away from Russia. Certainly, I think that the Saudi-sponsored peace dialogue in August, I think, was a very interesting move. That finally, certain Middle Eastern governments that have been cooperating with Russia, that they've also started to see the Ukrainian side. And I think that part of it is simply that these governments don't want to be told what to do, but that they often will come to, I think, decisions, policies that we can live with if we sort of allow them to get there on their own. And I think that this has been happening, with the Saudis in particular. I think that they have seen that it was the Russians who pulled out of the grain export deal in July. Certainly, Putin has tried very hard to blame the West for this, but I think Middle Eastern countries understand that this could have kept going on, and it was Putin himself, and this affects their interests very much. So I think that patience is required, and that we have to simply, indicate. And there is this perception that the U.S. is withdrawing, but I think that we've stayed in the region, and that we have to make sure that is known. We still have tens of thousands of troops. I don't think anyone else is going to be sending troops there. I don't think that. And what I think is interesting is that all the complaints that we've seen about the U.S., it's clear that the Saudis want to have a bilateral defense agreement, so it must not be so bad. And obviously the Abraham Accord diplomacy, I think this is very important, and perhaps it's not going to lead immediately to a Saudi-Israeli recognition. But the main thing is the cooperation we're seeing between, say, the Saudis and the Israelis, that is occurring, and that's a good thing. And so I think that we're not doing so badly.
I would agree with many of your points. And on the other side of that balance sheet, we see things like the BRICS economic group of countries expanding membership this summer to include countries in the Middle East, especially Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And Gangzheng, I wonder if you could jump in here. What's at stake for the region in that? So we do see them doing things like seeking defense cooperation agreements with the U.S. that are ironclad, but then also doing things like joining BRICS, which they know is sort of an annoyance to the U.S. and the West. What do MENA countries have to gain or risk by joining something like this economic coalition? And what are China's interests behind such an expansion? Is it looking for political goals? Is it looking for economic goals? What do you think China and these countries of the region that have joined are really going for here?
Okay, so I think that we all know that the BRICS was starting from a very kind of like a purely economic starting point. The concept that developed by Goldman Sachs, right? And I think, but now obviously it has some kind of like a political connotations. But however, I believe that joining this kind of like the mechanism of the BRICS, especially we are witnessing so many kind of like MENA countries are joining this kind of mechanism means that they want to like wholeheartedly or completely siding with China on everything. So this is actually what I trying to argue in an article actually published jointly by ISPI and Atlantic Council last year, that I believe that the world in this round of great power competition is actually witnessing the rise of the new intermediate zones. And in this kind of like intermediate zone, I think the Middle Eastern countries are the very perfect representative of all these countries. I think outside the great powers, they're trying to use strategic hedgings to maximize their interest. I think Middle Eastern countries are the perfect examples of this kind of like intermediate zones. But also, I think to some extent, the European countries and some kind of like Asian countries, Latin American countries are also doing the same thing, but to different degrees. So I think that I think for those kind of like the regional countries of the MENA that join the BRICS, I think they have kind of like two, if we really want to say that which is the political motivation and which is the economic motivation, I think there are two main considerations. And for the economic part, I think is that all these countries in the intermediate zones or outside the West, they are thinking about this kind of like a possibility of how to do during a crisis. Okay, so in this crisis, that because as we can see in the last 2 years, that due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that some countries might not have this kind of like tensions with the West, but they are still kind of like worrying that what will happen if themselves or their like trading partners were kind of like suddenly thrown out of the SWIFT system or suddenly like sanctioned by the West. So I think that these countries are trying to have some kind of like substitute plan for economic cooperations, as I mentioned, for this kind of like the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that I think the long-term goal is that they will have this kind of like system that to bypass to some extent the Western sanctions. Okay, so this is the economic considerations. And for the political perspective, I think that these countries are, by joining the BRICS, I think they are trying to reaffirming their commitment not to go into another Cold War. That they are still trying to have this kind of like strategic hedgings between the great powers, no matter they are China, United States, Russia, or European countries. They are still trying to say that, oh, we will cooperate and with all the great powers on different kind of issues, but only to maximize our national interest. And trying to have this kind of like a room for maneuver and to promote their strategic autonomy during this round of great power competitions.
Very thorough. Thank you so much. And we may revisit that. We're taking some questions from the audience now. And just a reminder, go ahead and send them in if you have them. We have about 15 minutes left. But let me ask Nikolay if you would address this question. The Wagner insurrection is over. Its future is uncertain. Its leadership is splintered. But has that impacted anything where they are present on the ground in the region? To paraphrase Mark Twain, have the rumors of their death been greatly exaggerated? Or has there been a shift in the dynamics in a way down to the local level where they are active? What is the future of Wagner in the region?
Well, we should be cautious about making any predictions here because there are certain options that those people whom we are considering dead are just enjoying their mojito right now somewhere else. But definitely what we can see from the ground, at the ground, there are no signs actually of decreasing importance of Wagner or ex-Wagner networks in the region. The problem here with Wagner that it definitely demonstrated itself as an important instrument that Russia could always use in the gray or black zones just to avoid the use of official military force. But at the same time, right now, Moscow is very cautious about getting involved in any other military adventures in the region. So for now, at least for now, this instrument is not as needed as it was before. But definitely the lesson was learned. And on the one hand, Moscow will definitely try to recreate a kind of a military company that could allow it to operate, as I said, in the gray zones. But at the same time, another, negative lesson that Moscow learned, that delegating some of its policies to non-state actors is extremely dangerous. And now one of the main actually challenges for the Russian presence in the Middle East, and not only, is coming from the fact that for the last 10, 15 years, the number of these non-governmental actors substantially increased. I mean, those who were shaping Russian approaches towards the region. But all of them, they had absolutely different attitude, not always in compliance with the Moscow vision towards the war in Ukraine. and not all of them were ready and are ready to serve the Russians' need. Or on the opposite, like Mr. Prigozhin, seeing their increasing importance, they are trying to behave differently and to dictate their will to the Kremlin, which also adds a certain factor of instability and unpredictability to the future of Russian presence in the region.
So you're saying we should not make predictions, and yet we're going to hang on every word you just said, let's be honest. I've got a question.
We don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately.
Right, exactly. It would be broken by now if we had. Mark, can I ask you to address a question that came in from the audience? And then, gentlemen, I'd love it if you have thoughts, please do add them. What conditions would be required for the region to align more closely with the U.S. and the West? You know, what is the U.S. missing? What could we do? Could the West in general do?
You know, I think that basically they would have to we'd have to deliver things that might be very politically difficult for us to do, and that is to essentially drop sort of any kind of criticism about human rights, democratization. In other words, that we are supporting these governments, that this is what they want. I think that during the Cold War, that America supported the status quo, the revolutionary Soviet Union, and for a time China were the disruptive powers. Now I think that at the present, Russia and China are status quo powers. They support the governments in office. The U.S. has traditionally done too, but we saw with regard to the Arab Spring, etc., that when the U.S. Sees it, there's a chance that it supports change. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this, but it only works if it's going to be successful. And I think that certainly Putin has been able to portray the U.S. as a disruptive power in the region. And I think that we have to basically focus on what it is that we really want. In other words, that if what we really want is to avoid sort of the spread of Iranian influence, avoid disruption, in other words, that the downfall of the current governments is not going to lead to liberal democracy. It's probably going to lead to something far, far worse. And so then why talk about this? And so I think that that's going to be something that the U.S. will have to, for them to move closer to the U.S., they're going to have to do to feel reassured about this. Also, I just think that that we're going to have to do more to help them when the Iranians or their allies launch attacks. I think that they're very unhappy. Why are we being so supportive of Ukraine when we weren't supportive of them when they were attacked? And I think that the U.S. is going to have to do more to show that it really is an ally. So I think there's a lot of reassurance. Now, obviously, from our side, we're going to want some reassurance that if we're going to make this extra commitment to you, we don't want to see you so much flirting with our main adversaries. But I think that we're just entering a period in which there is just a lot of uncertainty that the Middle Eastern governments are going to work with Russia. They are going to work with China. We're going to have to tolerate that to a certain extent. And I think that Middle Eastern governments also need to understand that we are concerned about Ukraine and that they do have some equities with the Iranians supporting the Russians so heavily. That's not in the interests of our Middle Eastern allies, it seems to me. And certainly with regard to the impact on the grain, that we all have an interest in seeing this resolved peacefully. So I think that more dialogue, more understanding, that not assuming about what one another's interests are, behavior, and be careful. In other words, if one's going to be critical, and I'm not saying that criticism isn't deserved, but what's going to be the impact of these statements? How is this going to impact overall American policy? That these are things that need to be focused on.
Acknowledging these interests and that it's not just a situation of a grievance and a grieve maker. Gentlemen, I'd like to turn to you. We'll keep those in mind because obviously the U.S., the West, any partner has its own interests as well. But from the point of view of the countries in the region, what is the U.S. and the West, what are they missing?
Okay, my point of view is that I will have a more pessimistic attitude to regarding the influence of great powers on the region. This is, I think that with this kind of the trend we are witnessing, that in this kind of like a digital age, and with this kind of the rise of the intermediate zone, I think the regional countries are gaining this kind of like upper hand when negotiating with all this kind of like great powers. And I think that they are trying to, as I mentioned before, they are trying to maximize their interests. So they will trying to cooperate with all this kind of like great powers in all these kind of like particular issues, and then it will kind of to some extent to diminish the overall control abilities of the extra regional powers on the regional affairs. As a comparison to the Cold War, we would say there's some kind of like many kind of like cases about whether there is a dog wag tail or tail wag dog, but predominantly speaking, I think that this kind of Moscow and Washington has this kind of like a very great importance on its regional allies during the Cold War. But I'm afraid that in the future, with such trend of developments, all these great powers will becoming this kind of like a service provider to the regional countries, more or less.
Fascinating. Nikolay, anything to add?
Well, I'm fully supporting what was said before by my colleagues. I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that we have certain disparity between the, or difference between the political discourse that we have in the region about the fallouts of the conflict and the discourse on its economic impact. Whereas in the political sphere, definitely we see that the majority of regional players, they see no alternative to the US as the important ally, as the ally number one. Then in the economic sphere, there are certain concerns with the fact that there is an ongoing weaponization of the economic relations. And at least if we're talking about the GCC, the Arab monarchies of the Gulf, they are quite scared that the sanctions that they see being imposed on Russia, one day they might in a certain way be imposed against them, or somehow their economic interests might be undermining with the fall of the liberal model of economic relations that's now also falling prey of the securitization of economic relations in Europe, in the West. And from this point of view, I guess a lot would help if to improve relations between the GCC, the region, and the US, and drive them further from Russia, if they receive certain guarantees that this weaponization of economy is not going to undermine their natural interests. Otherwise, we would definitely see them trying to learn the Russia's experience, or even to join some of those schemes that Russia is offering them, including, for instance, this fancy idea of de-dollarization that, with all my skeptical attitude to it, is greatly being implemented with the participation of the American allies as well.
Really great point. We're going to do a Blitzkrieg round here. Last questions, about a minute each. I would like to encapsulate all of your thinking, and I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit difficult. Mark, we'll start with you, give you guys another 30 seconds, 1 minute to think about it. What advice would you offer to the US, the West, and to the region for navigating this competition if the war continues or the war expands? What would you, if you were in a room with each of their leaders, you can pick and choose which countries you want to address in this question, but what advice would you have for either side of those negotiating tables?
Well, I think that if the war, I think, is likely to continue, I hope it doesn't expand, but that's always a possibility. One thing I think is for sure is that what I think everyone is finding is that these issues can't be compartmentalized. In other words, there's not simply the war in Ukraine and then the situation in the Gulf and the situation in East Asia. that they are linked. And I think that as time goes on, what we're seeing is is more of an alliance. Certainly, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that there is linkage between these, and that I think we're going to need some kind of accommodation. In other words, if the certain countries want our help against Iran, we're going to need some more help from them with regard to Ukraine, and they should, because obviously the Russian-Iranian cooperation is not ultimately in their interests. So I'd hope that there would be dialogue about this in particular.
Gangzheng.
Okay, so for the suggestions to the regional countries, personally, I don't have any particular ones, because as I argued before, that no matter what we do, no matter what China, the United States, Russia, or the European do in the foreseeable future, there's no way to drastically change the behavior or the patterns of the regional countries. They will still trying to use these strategic hedgings to deal with all the great powers. So there's virtually impossible to expect that by doing one thing or two, that they will suddenly totally change their positions. But for the great powers, I personally hope that there will be some kind of room of cooperation in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa. I always believe that to the west of the Malacca Strait, that actually China, United States, and European countries, they are all status quo powers. So actually, there's a lot of things that these countries can work together, especially China and the United States, in the Middle Eastern regions. For example, and also with the European countries, such as the refugee problems, by using or by helping the industrialization of the regional countries and to reduce the potential problem of future refugee crisis. And also for the climate change, obviously, there's so many things that we could do. And I think that one more very important thing about this kind of potential cooperation, that it might, to some extent, serve as some kind of starting point to rebuild the trust among the great powers. And I think this could be a very, very important possible contribution to the war peace in the long run.
Thank you, Gangzheng. And Nikolay.
Sorry. Well, I definitely don't want to give advice to the Russian government, but if we're talking about the regional players, I would say stay pragmatic. Think about those challenges that are coming forward and not necessarily related to the conflict, like, for instance, the challenges of the fourth energy transition. And don't misinterpret the US policy. The Americans are not leaving the region. They're just reformatting, reshaping their presence. As for the Western powers, well, first of all, don't underestimate Russia. The Russian authorities are very good at punching way above their weight and being pragmatic and using opportunities. Second, keep in mind that, for instance, in 1960s, 1970s, the success of the Soviet diplomacies in the Middle East was conditioned not by the intricacy and proficiency of the Soviet diplomats, but by the mistakes that the Westerners were doing in their approaches to the Middle East. That means that an improvement of those miscalculations that we have now, including misperception of the United States, could definitely improve the Western relations with the Middle Eastern powers, and definitely decrease the influence of Putin's Russia in the region. Thank you.
This is fantastic. You all avoided any FAR regulation violations, and you avoided giving actionable intelligence or advice to foreign governments. And you reminded us of all of our hubris, which is extremely valuable lesson at times like these. So please, you all, thank our panelists with me. Thank Dr. Mark Katz, Dr. Nikolay Kozhanov, and Dr. Gangzheng She. We will take a 10-minute break and reconvene.